Entrepreneurial Edge is brought to you by Business Banking from FNB, because small ideas can lead to big business. FNB, how can we help you?
Hello and welcome to the Entrepreneurial Edge. I'm Chris Bishop. Now, when you think multimillionaire, you think glamour, private jets, and all the best parties. But there are many entrepreneurs who are happier out of the limelight, even though their financial success is often in the spotlight. Now, one such man is Stephen Saad. Now, he's the head of Aspen Pharmacare, a major player in the South African pharmaceutical business and the largest listed company on the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. Now, he could have had an easy life in business. He qualified as a chartered accountant and could have gone into the family business in the sleepy seaside town of Durban on South Africa's east coast. Instead, he chose the cut and thrust of South Africa's corporate business world and has made a fortune. According to the latest Forbes list, Stephen Saad has a net worth of $640 million. That makes him the 20th richest man in Africa. How did the quiet man from Durban do it? Well, let's find out. Stephen, you're joining us in the studio here. I mean, 640 million, what do you think? Too high, too low? Give us an idea.
Oh, it doesn't matter, you know. I think the first million was the tricky one. After that, you know, if there's a market crash, it changes and it goes up and down. And
so you don't keep a regular track on it?
No.
But one thing, Aliko Dangote, the richest man in Africa, he told me a couple of months ago that he thinks that the actual Forbes valuation of him is a lot lower than it really is because they only do listed assets. I mean, do you think that's fair to say?
Well, he knows his unlisted assets for sure. If it only measures listed assets, you've got unlisted assets, then oh yes, it would be understated.
So let's start with you and your background. What kind of a family did you grow up in? Was it a sort of entrepreneurial environment?
Well, you know, I just came from a really warm family, a homely family. If I look back at my father, he qualified as a chartered accountant, but you know he had to work for everything he got. So his very first salary he had to give to his parents. So he probably was not much of a risk taker from that perspective, and he went into profession. And you know, in those days, if you were in the profession, you could do other things. And he dabbled in property, and he did very, very successfully in those things that he did. And I think that initially he really was very keen for us to follow in his footsteps and join him in his profession. But I absolutely knew I wasn't joining the profession. I knew that for sure.
And I mentioned Durban in the intro. I mean, your family, you've been a long-standing Durban family.
Yes, we have been. So, yes.
And to this day, we'll talk more about that later in the interview. But so you qualified as a chartered accountant at university. Yes. And then you were going to go into the family firm, and one of your contemporaries said you'd be like a bird with clipped wings if you did.
Yes.
How did your father take it when you said, sorry, I'm not doing it?
Well, he sort of got a hint of it when those days you wrote your exams and then you went to articles, and I battled a bit during my article period, believe it or not. I passed the exams and I just had to sort of really do time, if you want to call it that. And I remember I did an audit of a very big company. And I wrote the partner a whole lot of things on there about what was wrong with their company and how they'd provided. It is a huge company still today. And he said, oh, that's a good point. You've picked up all these provisions. In those days, you could provide and all the rest of the things to make your profit. I'll deal with it. And he just signed it off. You know, they have the private meeting and the accounts got signed off. And thought, well, there's no little worth in what I've done, is there? I mean, but all this time, there's a little worth. And so when they asked what we thought of the profession, etc., and everyone says, oh, well, you can save money doing provisions and helping your client do this and that. And they asked me what I thought, and I was the only one who wrote back and said, I think it's a statutory body, which offended the partnership no end. So when I upped sticks and went and played rugby during my articles, and I had to do a 6-month period of extra for my sin of breaking my articles. I think by then my dad, and my partner was the one who said I was like a bird with the wings clipped. At that stage, I think my dad had a fairly good indication that I probably wasn't going to be around the.
And then you went off and you joined a pharmaceutical company, which was actually selling in those days. We're talking, what, 25 longer ago?
Yes, yeah.
Was selling pharmaceuticals in the townships in South Africa. And it seemed to have taught you quite a lot because you went in there personally, didn't you? And you went out and sold the stuff. What was that like?
Well, I started off in the office and I realized that this business was all about selling, and that if you didn't understand what the clients were doing, you had to do it. So I packed up and I went to go and see all our client base. It was probably what set the groundstones for my understanding of the market in South Africa. And when I look back at why we were so confident in acquiring South African druggists years later, it was because of this grounding that we had in here. it was very interesting. It was a time, it was pre-1994. It was in the 80s, tensions were quite high, and it was just incredible. I found and having been to a school where there were only white people at the school, it was such an eye-opener.
But you grew up in the suburbs. I mean, how much of a shock was it for you at that time?
It was, and it was just so interesting to listen to a whole, I mean, you got a certain story through the media, and I got a whole different, my eyes were completely opened. I'll never forget, I saw a doctor in Sasolburg, and I said to him, and it also gave me a sense on branding. We had a cough mixture, and really it was exactly the same liquid in both. The one just had a fancy box and a fancy packaging, and the other one was just just a sticker on it. And the one was like 50 cents, and the one was like $10. And I went to the doctor and I said to him, well, you can have this one, for your cash patients of 50 cents, and this one for 10 Rand for your medical aid patients. And he said to me, hey, what are you saying to me, Steve? Are you trying to tell me that my person that works in a farm has got a different sickness to somebody that works in a mine because they've got a medical aid? I said, no, doctor, it's exactly the same medicine. I know, we make the stuff, it's the same. He said, no, but look at the perception of what people think. I can't do this with my client base. So you'd better get me that product that you've got that expensive one at half price, so I can give one to the one that can pay and one that can't pay, so for free. So it was just valuable learning lessons, and it was a fantastic experience.
And there must have been some very interesting, if not maybe sometimes dangerous experience in those days. I mean, anything that springs to mind where you felt you really lived?
No, I was hijacked on London Street in Alexandria. Yeah, you do, but it was you felt alive. Put it that way. It's a life worth living. It was not.
And also gave you that idea as well of that big untapped market there at the time, in the way things were. You say pre-94 in South Africa,
yes.
There's a huge amount of black people out there who needed pharmaceutical but couldn't get hold of them. Is that what gave you the germ of the idea?
Yeah, and I think that there's a whole informal economy that's not measured because people don't want to go there and measure it. I mean, I remember the tax. One of the clients I worked for when I was at Cooper & Lybrand, because after I'd had my experience with the big company, I said, please don't send me there. And so they sent me to an entrepreneur in Umlazi, and I worked with him, and that was fantastic working with him. And the people, for example, the tax people who were owed a fortune in VAT were not prepared to go out there to go and see him and meet him. And so I asked him what he could afford to pay. I said, Steve, I can pay 5,000 Rand a month for 12 months or whatever it was. And I think he probably earned 100 times more. So I said to the taxer, this is what you want, this is what you can get. And I said, fine, that's it. And so that became and that became how the economy, the sort of the formal economy, saw the informal economy. Well, 5 grand, that's it. But actually, they probably should have asked him for 100,000 Rand a month or something. But they weren't prepared to go out there and measure it. And I realized that there was a completely untapped economy out there. And actually, it wasn't only in South Africa that I started to see. You start to see it in places like Brazil. I started to see in all these developing markets. There's an economy that's not measured, and it's growing.
That's one thing. I mean, how many of your peers, do you think, in the corporate world, of the cut and thrust corporate world, as I said in the intro, of South Africa, still have these kind of assumptions that, oh, well, there's no market there, don't bother going here? Would you say?
I think a lot of them do, because you read magazines and they're confined to a certain thought process. But unless you've actually been out there yourself, you're not going to believe it unless you see it.
Would you recommend that all your young managers get out there and get involved, get their hands dirty before they start making decisions in the boardrooms? All our
top people that have come through our ranks, largely that's been the way they've come through. We haven't had a lot of success in bringing people into our business from the outside. Even the business in Australia, it was the guys who started the business. So I think it's a critical thing to have. There's nothing to cover experience, no qualifications, no formal qualification, than actually doing it yourself out there.
And fast forward to 1997, and you set up your own company, Aspen Pharmacare. And do you remember that first day when you started out?
I do. I remember it very well, because we were waiting for imported stock that didn't arrive, so we quickly called an impromptu conference. And after 3 days of conferencing, and the stock still hadn't arrived, we then said, okay, it's time for some action cricket and some team bonding. So it was the first 10 days I remember very well. On day 10, when the stock arrived, then suddenly all chaos broke loose, kicked them all out, and it was time to go out and work. So no, I remember the first day well.
So where was it coming from?
It was coming at that stage. It was coming from Europe. and it hadn't arrived and couldn't clear customs, and it was just a bit of a disaster. So yeah, that's
And what were you saying to your customers at the time? Presumably you'd signed up.
You know, we'd got it was just our rep teams involved. And they were supposed to go out and sell, so we quickly brought them for a hastily convened conference at, what did you call Durban? A sleepy spot somewhere on the coast, and we brought them all down, and we lived true to them, and they thought this was the greatest company in the whole world to work for, because nowhere else were they not told about a conference. And when they do have a conference, allowed to play 7 days of action cricket and have bras on the beach, and just it was a great company to work for. But on day 11 did they realize they were working for a company.
Exactly. And how many people did you start with? How small was small when you started?
We started with about 10 reps.
Really?
10 reps and maybe about 5 or 10 people in the admin, and that was it, yes.
And one office, and that was it?
That was it, yes.
Really? And yourself then, were you still out there?
Yes, I was, but a lot of the reps we'd had worked with us in a prior life, so we knew a lot of the people we worked with, and yeah, that's how we started.
And how fast was it, to actually get to, say, a middle-sized business before you started to move on to?
We saw a lot of opportunities in acquiring some products from multinationals, and we also saw the opportunities that we'd seen in the previous life. Now remember, in the first business we started, raising funds is never easy. You're discounting debtors, you're doing all sorts of things that were, I suppose if I'd had a little bit more financial nous or experience there, maybe we would have done an IPO or listing at that point. But I didn't know all of that, and someone offers you more money than you could spend for the rest of your life, and you were 20-something, you say, look, I'll take it, thank you.
Actually, just one thing I do have to ask you. I mean, I was reading your biog, and it says that you got 20 million, which is about, what, $2.5 million at age 29. Yeah. Now, a lot of people, probably including a lot of journalists, would have just invested it and said, right, okay, that's me done for life. Yeah. Why didn't you do that?
I did think I was going to do that, by the way. That's what I was going to do, and I sort of went to the Seychelles, and I went to the game farms, and then we had one daughter, and then I had twin daughters that followed. And it was just more exhausting being at home, so I thought we'd do something a little bit smaller, but I had a good sense of what we do. I mean, the interim, I'd had a restraint of trade for 3 years on.
Oh, right, of course, yes.
I actually went into education at that stage. We got into a set of something called Varsity College, but then I always knew I was coming back to pharmaceuticals, but I was properly capitalized this time. Well, I thought I was properly capitalized.
Well, actually, $2.5 million is a lot of money, but now you talked about these daughters, which we'll talk in the second half. I can see all the money obviously went on school fees, so we'll talk a lot more about that in the second half. We're going for a quick ad break now. When we return, I'll find out more about our entrepreneur this week, Stephen Saad of the Aspen Group, Chief Executive. Stay with us.